Something is happening right now that every American who values the truth needs to stop and pay attention to, because when a government starts hiding the pictures, it almost always means they don't want you to see what the pictures show. A satellite imagery company called Planet Labs sent an email to journalists who had been using the company's images to report on the U.S.-Israeli bombing of Iran and Iran's retaliatory strikes, telling them that it was implementing an indefinite withhold of imagery covering Iran and across the broader Middle Eastern countries where this conflict is unfolding. And the reason they gave? They were acting on the Trump administration's request. Think about that for a second. The Trump White House reached out to a private satellite imagery firm and asked them, successfully, to stop letting the press see what is happening from the sky. No satellite pictures. No independent visual documentation of what is being bombed and what is being destroyed and who is being killed. The skies over one of the most consequential wars America has been involved in decades just went dark by government request. And this matters enormously because at the same time those pictures are being withheld, the numbers are being withheld too. Almost 750 U.S. troops have been wounded or killed in the Middle East since October 2023, according to an analysis by The Intercept. But the Pentagon won't acknowledge it. U.S. Central Command appears to be engaged in what a defense official called a casualty cover-up, offering lowball and outdated figures and failing to provide clarifications on military deaths and injuries. 750 American service members wounded, killed. And the Pentagon's official response has been to offer numbers that don't even come close. That is not a clerical error. That is a decision. Now let's be precise about what is happening on the ground, because the scale of this conflict is something that most Americans have not fully absorbed yet. On February 28, 2026, U.S. and Israeli forces launched nearly 900 strikes in just 12 hours, targeting Iranian missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and leadership. 900 strikes in half a day. The initial wave of strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of other officials. The Supreme Leader of Iran, the man who had run that country since 1989, was killed in the opening hours of what the United States named Operation Epic Fury. And yet here we are, more than 5 weeks into this war, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the most powerful military and intelligence institution inside Iran, is still fighting, still claiming victories, still launching missiles. Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone strikes targeting U.S. embassies, military installations, and oil infrastructure throughout the Middle East. And this is where the story gets really complicated and really important for Americans to understand clearly, because the Trump administration told you and told the world that this war was going to be fast, that it was going to be clean, that Iran's military was basically finished after the opening strikes. Trump himself stood before reporters and said that Iran had no navy, no air force, no air detection, no radar left after the initial attacks. Gone, done, over. And yet the missiles kept coming. The drones kept flying. At least 15 U.S. troops were wounded in an Iranian attack on a Saudi airbase that hosts American troops. At least 15 U.S. troops in the Middle East have died since the beginning of the Iran war, including 6 personnel who were killed in a drone strike on Port Shuaiba, Kuwait, and a soldier who died due to an enemy attack on March 1, 2026, at Prince Sultan Air Base, Saudi Arabia. So when the IRGC claims that it is winning, or at minimum that it has not lost, it is not making that claim in a vacuum. It is making that claim against the backdrop of a war that has lasted far longer and cost far more American blood than the official narrative suggested it would. And the administration's response to that gap between narrative and reality has been, increasingly, to close off the information, to squeeze the pipeline of visual evidence, to push the casualty numbers down, to tell Planet Labs to go dark. Let's talk about what it means structurally for a democratic government to suppress satellite imagery during wartime. It is difficult to tell which side is winning in the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran because the objectives and strategies for victory of the combatants are so different. That's from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most respected defense think tanks in Washington. They are saying plainly and carefully that evaluating who is winning this war is genuinely hard, because the two sides have radically different definitions of what victory looks like. The United States came in with a list of goals: end Iran's nuclear program, degrade its missile capabilities, stop its support for proxy forces, and most ambitiously, achieve regime change in Tehran. Despite more than 2 weeks of relentless airstrikes, U.S. intelligence assessments say Iran's regime likely will remain in place for now, weakened but more hard-line, with the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps exerting greater control, more hard-line, greater IRGC control. That is the U.S. government's own intelligence community saying that the war may be producing the opposite of its stated objective. And look at what the IRGC has actually done in the last several weeks. Iranian strikes targeted U.S. embassies and military installations in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Oman, and Jordan. That is not the behavior of a defeated military force. That is the behavior of an institution that is battered, that has lost enormous numbers of its personnel, that has had its leadership decimated, and is still striking back across an entire region. During the weekend of April 3rd and 4 alone, 14 attacks using ballistic missiles were carried out from Iran, with half of them directed at the northern region. And the IRGC's naval forces claimed that on April 4th it attacked a vessel described as linked to Israel in the Strait of Hormuz using a drone. Now, here is something that I want you to sit with, because I think it is one of the most significant and underreported dimensions of this war. Due to Iran's selective blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the cost of energy is soaring as the world is losing as much as 20 million barrels of oil per day from Middle East producers. Since the war began, Brent crude is trading up more than 50%. According to the IEA, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the biggest oil shock in history. The biggest oil shock in history, not in decades, in history. And what that means, practically, for American families is that the war is not just happening on the other side of the world in some abstract geopolitical theater. The war is at your gas station. The war is in your utility bills. The war is in the price of everything that moves by truck, which is almost everything you buy. The economic reality of this conflict has already crossed the ocean and landed in American households, and very little of the official communication from the Trump administration has been honest with the American people about that connection. Let's talk about the F-15 and what happened in the mountains of Iran, because this episode tells you so much about the information war that is happening parallel to the military war. The F-15E Strike Eagle normally carries a pilot and a weapons systems officer. The U.S. military launched an immediate rescue operation to extract the 2 crew members from Iranian territory using special operations forces and air support assets. The weapons systems officer escaped into the Zagros Mountains, while the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, SEAL Team 6, and local nomadic tribesmen raced to find him. That image, American Special Forces and Iranian Revolutionary Guards racing across mountain terrain in the heart of Iran, each trying to get to a wounded American airman first. That is the image of this war in its most raw and human form. Iran claimed multiple aircraft shootdowns during the operation. The U.S. claimed there had been a shootdown of one of its A-10 Thunderbolt II attack aircraft and the intentional destruction of 2 of its Lockheed C-130 Hercules transport aircraft in order to avoid capture. And notice the framing that came out of Washington when the second airman was finally rescued. Trump used the operation to claim a great victory, posting, "We got him," on Truth Social after the second crew member was rescued, describing the operation as the most daring operation in U.S. history. Now, the bravery of those special operations forces is real. The skill required to pull off that rescue deep inside Iran, under fire, against a determined enemy on their home terrain, is genuinely extraordinary. But notice what the victory framing is doing. The F-15 was shot down. American aircraft, multiple of them, were lost or destroyed. American forces had to conduct a desperate, days-long rescue operation inside hostile territory. And the administration took what was, by any measure, a crisis and repackaged it entirely as a triumph. That is the information architecture of this war. Newly released satellite imagery shows at least 28 craters along several roads in central Isfahan province, around 20 kilometers from a remote airstrip where U.S. forces destroyed their own aircraft after they became damaged. 28 craters carved into the roads of central Iran by American bombs dropped to keep Iranian forces away from the rescue site. And that imagery, that independent visual evidence, was available before Planet Labs went dark at the request of the Trump White House. Going forward, how will journalists and researchers and ordinary Americans verify what is actually happening? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a real and urgent problem for a democracy at war. Because here's the thing about information in wartime. Governments have always managed information during conflict. That is not new. What is different about this moment is the combination. The satellite imagery suppression, the casualty undercounting, the victory framing of operational setbacks, and the scale of the conflict itself. In response to the attacks by the United States and Israel, Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone strikes targeting U.S. embassies, military installations, and oil infrastructure throughout the Middle East. Iran hoped its broad retaliation would exact costs and pressure its adversaries into mediation. And it has exacted costs, real costs, costs that are being systematically undercounted in official Pentagon communications. The pro-Iran militant group Guardians of the Blood Brigade claimed responsibility for attacks on the U.S. victory base near Baghdad International Airport and Erbil Kurdistan region, Iraq. The Islamic resistance in Iraq claimed responsibility for over 23 drone strikes on U.S. assets in Erbil. This is the architecture of Iranian power projection, not just the IRGC itself, but the network of proxy forces that Iran has spent 4 decades cultivating across the region, and which the U.S. has spent years trying to degrade without fully succeeding. Even as Iran's conventional military has taken staggering losses, this network persists, continues to operate, and continues to generate American casualties. And what does the IRGC's claim of victory actually mean in that context? It means something specific and strategic. Iran knows it cannot win a conventional military exchange with the United States and Israel. It never claimed it could. What the IRGC has been telling its own population and telling the world is that it can outlast the campaign, that it can sustain enough damage, enough loss, and still continue to function, that the cost it imposes on U.S. forces, on U.S. allies, on global energy markets, on American domestic politics will eventually make the war unsustainable. That is a definition of victory that has nothing to do with battlefield supremacy and everything to do with political endurance and strategic patience. And the fact that we are now 5+ weeks into a war that was supposed to trigger rapid regime change with Iran's intelligence services still intact enough to adapt and react, with the IRGC still launching ballistic missiles across the region, suggests that the IRGC's version of this war, that whatever you think of them morally or politically, is not purely fantasy. Trump told reporters he is not ruling out sending U.S. ground troops into Iran if they were necessary, adding that the operation was way ahead of schedule. Way ahead of schedule, he says, while simultaneously not ruling out boots on the ground. Those two statements, held together in your mind for just a moment, describe the gap at the center of this war's official narrative. If it is going so well, why are ground troops still on the table? If it is way ahead of schedule, whose schedule are we talking about? Because the schedule that was sold to the American people, the one that implied this would be decisive and swift, that schedule is clearly not the one that reality is operating on. And so here we are. A war that has killed and wounded hundreds of American service members, the precise number of which the Pentagon will not confirm. A war that has produced the largest oil shock in recorded history, which hits every American at the pump and the checkout line. A war in which the U.S. government has asked a private company to stop providing satellite imagery to the press. A war in which a downed F-15 became, through the alchemy of political messaging, the most daring operation in U.S. history. A war in which U.S. intelligence says the IRGC is actually gaining internal power inside Iran, even as Iranian military commanders claim they are winning the propaganda battle against the United States. All of that is true simultaneously. And the only way to understand all of it and to hold your government accountable for the decisions it is making in your name and at the cost of American lives and American treasure is to insist on the information that is being withheld. Because when they hide the satellite images, they are not hiding them from Iran. Iran knows exactly what is happening on Iranian soil. They are hiding the images from you. That is the thing to understand. The secrecy in this war is directional. It points inward. It points at the American public. And if you want to know why, the answer is not complicated. The images show things that are harder to spin than the press releases. The casualty numbers are harder to frame as victory when the real numbers are known. The craters in the roads of Isfahan, the wreckage of American aircraft on the Iranian plateau, the missiles still falling on Saudi and Kuwaiti infrastructure week after week. All of that, seen clearly and verified independently, tells a story that is more complicated, more costly, and more morally serious than the story being told from the podium. And in a democracy, especially in a democracy at war, the most dangerous thing is not the enemy's propaganda. It is your own government's decision to decide for you what you are allowed to see.